Let's go.
Hi. Exactly. Let's go and listen what Andreas Schuele brought with him.
Right. Well, I'm sure you all want another paper on a completely different topic, and that you're wide awake, and so that's why I decided to kind of stand up, because otherwise I'll probably fall asleep during my own papers.
You're doing this in German, right?
Yes, absolutely.
There is a limit to how much you can fall asleep.
That's right, but you're forgiven if you feel like taking a little cat nap during the presentation. It's perfectly okay. So, living in the part of Germany that until 1989 was a socialist country, and as such mostly disconnected from any particular religious tradition, I often find myself involved in conversations with people, both young and old, who have no religious background. When I grew up in West Germany, it was fashionable to self-identify as atheists, so that was sort of my time. But of course, atheists typically have an understanding of what they are against. Now, this is very different today because people are not usually opposed to religion in principle, at least not in my part of the world, but they simply do not see a reason to add religion to their lives. One can have a good life, be a responsible husband, wife, father, mother, be a faithful citizen of one's communities. There's no opening in people's lives, as it were, no need or desire for what organized religion is or what it might have to offer. The phenomenon of modern secularism has often been described and assessed as either a sign of progressive emancipation or as a symptom of decay in Western-style societies. The situation of largely secularized societies yields some revealing insights into the nature of religions such as Judaism and Christianity. First of all, religions are extremely complex entities consisting of virtually impenetrable networks of beliefs and practices that have grown over time. This means that being religious or having a religion is a matter of long-term exposure to and socialization in a particular religion. It requires an intellectual and, as we just heard, emotional and experiential disposition that one typically develops over a lifetime rather than by a focused, intentional effort. Secularism, in my reading, marks an interruption of these long-term processes, which is, of course, exactly what defendants of secularism, such as Jürgen Habermas or others, see as a healthy development. Religions cannot claim truth and acceptance simply by referring to their own tradition. They're just as much subject to public scrutiny and challenge as every other worldview. This puts religion in a dilemma situation. On the one hand, it is something that requires immersion in a tradition. On the other hand, it operates in a world that believes in rational choices and in the possibility of a good life that does not depend on any specific religious commitment. To be sure, a secularized world is not per se a hostile environment for religion, although it is certainly not religion's natural environment either. However, this is only one side of the problem. Not only is it difficult for people without prior exposure to gain access to the complexities of religion, it seems equally difficult for religious people to achieve critical distance to their beliefs and practices. As paradoxical as it may sound, one can be religious without knowing what that actually is, by simply functioning in ways that are consistent with the views and expectations of a given community. Such a lack of critical distance, reflection, and accountability is, of course, the danger that lurks behind religious fundamentalism in its many contemporary variations. By that I don't necessarily mean militant Islamism or the like, but a more basic tendency of religious people to take their religion for granted. The danger of secularism for religious people seems to be that because others do not care, they do not feel obligated to account for what they believe. This may be part of the problem in the United States, where there seems to be a deadlock between religious conservatives and liberals these days. Now, finding new language. Given that we live in a world in which secularism and religious fundamentalism occur side by side, not just in the Middle East, but also in the US or Central Europe. Obviously, this is not something that we can solve this week, but what does it mean? But what does it mean for the work that we do and how we articulate ourselves both in religious environments and in the public arena? So, I think it's interesting that I don't think that has ever occurred before that you have two such opposing approaches, fundamentalism and secularism, really within the same cultural habitat. Now, an important task in this regard, it seems to me, is finding basic or basal language and images. The sociologist Niklas Luhmann calls it the most important task for modern societies and their social systems to reduce complexity. This does not mean to simplify things or even dumb them down, but to render them somewhat more manageable and accessible. Now, it may be in order to talk very briefly about a project that Rav Shabtai and myself have been thinking about for quite some time. We've looked at the concept of reverse engineering, or what I like even better, back engineering. Reverse engineering is a way of handling complex and mostly technical systems. The case of computer software is particularly instructive because, as we all know, over time it gets increasingly more complex with revisions, add-ons, enhanced speed, and the like. So all the things that I hate about my computer, that it gets more complex and I don't get it. But while every revision may be an improvement of a particular sequence of the software program, there's no guarantee that these revisions remain consistent with the original design and purpose. This is where reverse engineering is used. The task is to find out if a technical unit in its current form can still be traced back to the original blueprint. It is a way of ensuring continuity without precluding the possibility of change and growth. Now, religions too are complex systems that undergo development, mostly as a response to changing cultural and political environments. But precisely because these developments depend on situation and circumstance, the level to which they reconnect with a religion's original design may not always be clear. I think it is safe to say that the emphasis on historical studies that play such an important role right now in Judaism and Christianity is more and should be more than an effort to inventorize the religious past. Historical studies aim at highlighting what is new or at least different against the backdrop of what had already been there. There's a desire to assess the level of continuity and faithfulness in processes of historical development, even if this leads one to the conclusion that religions may not always be in continuity with or faithful to their original ideas. To that extent, one may well describe the intentions of historians of religion or exegetes like me, at least to some extent in terms of reverse engineering. There's a more or less explicit desire to get back to the blueprint, to the underlying design, or else the study of history would be an encyclopedic matter only. Now, the goal would be to show that processes that can be described as reverse engineering occurred quite early in Judaism and Christianity, namely already in the making and the composition of biblical books. And the working hypothesis that's sort of been our project for a while, is that both religions, Judaism and Christianity, from their inception, had a strong tendency towards developing ever-growing and forward-moving traditions, but at the same time to tie this development back to some basic beliefs and ideas that should not be lost or overgrown along the way. Now, to make all this abstract talk a little more specific, I want to turn to one particular biblical text, and that's the book of Genesis, and maybe illustrate some of what I mean by all of this. Now, a particularly instructive case of this backward orientation is the first book of the Hebrew Bible, Bereshit, or Genesis. Readers of Genesis have always noticed that this book is somewhat different from the rest of the Torah. Obviously, we're supposed to read Genesis as the first act of a story or even drama that unfolds over all 5 books of the Torah and even further. Genesis does not have the same religious significance as a foundational story as the book of Exodus and the Sinai pericope, and yet it is the first book of the Hebrew Bible, the front portal through which everyone has to enter the building. So what then is the significance of Genesis if it's not really the foundational story? What I want to do in the following is to delineate a reading of Genesis as a book that provides religious foundations without, however, being fundamentalist. It is a book that, in my understanding, wants to be a reference point in the complexities of religious beliefs and convictions. As such, Genesis offers a basic introduction to some of the essentials of Jewish and Christian religion. I know it's a bold statement, Jewish and Christian religion, but since we're among ourselves, I'll just risk the risky language. So let me focus on three concepts that seem particularly pertinent in this regard. First, the value of life. Second, promise and faith. And finally, God as the open question. So, the value of life. And now it gets more basic, down to real text that you all know, and I hope that it makes it easier to understand things. So, the value of life. The first thing that we learn about the world in Genesis 1 is that it is a morally ordered universe whose supreme purpose is to bring forth and protect life. While God creates both animated and unanimated entities, the order of creation makes it clear that the emergence of living beings is the actual goal of creation. According to verses 29 through 31, both humans and animals should be vegetarian, without exception. The course of the argument is logically simple. Beings who have the life substance should feed exclusively on that which has no life substance. In other words, in the world as God desires it to be, there should be no killing, not even in pursuit of food. It can easily be overlooked, especially if the creation account is read as a quasi-scientific text for its period, that it introduces an apparently quite intentional contrast to the world of its readers, in other words, to our world. The creation God originally intended is not identical with our world, and it's not supposed to be identical. This observation has also consequences for the final assessment of the creation as very good. This assessment results in a view of a world expected to be a place of peaceful coexistence of all living beings. This very expectation, however, is disappointed, and to this extent, the very good sounds unfulfilled in view of the real world. In this perspective, the creation account offers not only a description of the world as God's creation, but also functions simultaneously as a contrast to the reality of its readers. We eat meat, and there is violence, and this is not what's in the world of Genesis 1. Now, how does God design the world in such a way that it could be a peaceful universe? In order to keep the chaos forces that threaten life out of the created space, God establishes systems of order and governance. The firmament is put in place to keep the primordial waters at bay, whereas sun and moon are supposed to rule, mashal, the Hebrew word, so that darkness, the other chaos force, yields to light. This raises the questions as to the meaning of the dominion that humans, as images of God, are expected to exercise in the created realm. So what and how are they supposed to rule? What exactly needs to be dominated in a world that's actually very good? One may proceed from the assumption that this dominion is supposed to accord with the ordering and preserving activity of God, and therefore does not legitimate human tyranny over the world. But what more do the Hebrew terms radah and kabash mean, especially because they have an irreducibly violent and despotic implication? So these words do not mean to, all the nice translations that we have, to, take care of or something like that. They really mean to trample, to tread down, to subdue under one's feet. So there's a really violent tone to them. So why is that? Beyond the mere interpretation of the terminology, the question arises as to what in the worldview of Genesis 1 calls for human dominion. After all, the world was created in order by nothing less than God's own word and blessing. Now, if one directs one's view beyond the creation account, another reality comes into view, namely of a world in which all flesh is entangled in the expansion of violence, Hamas. The beginning of the priestly flood narrative states that after only a few generations of created life on earth, the world has already ended because it has become filled with violence. As in Genesis 6, 9 through 12, violence is understood primarily as a meaningless and excessive bloodshed in which animals and humans participate equally. In modern terms, it was a brutal world in which there was no longer any regard for life. When Genesis 1:28, the Dominium Terrae, is read with a view towards this description of violence, it is reasonable to assume that the commission to exercise dominion is intended precisely to hinder and restrain the expansion of violence. So in other words, what humans are supposed to control is the level of violence in the world. That was their task, and they failed. So human beings are not supposed to subdue their fellow creatures, but the potential for violence latent in all flesh. The concept of violence introduced in the flood narrative joins the elements of chaos, darkness, and the primordial waters, although with a difference that the latter threaten the world from the outside, whereas violence is in creatures' bones, as it were, and comes from the inside. The containment of destructive forces and the protection of life thus become the core of God's commission to humankind, and as such lies at the very heart of the ethical vision of the book of Genesis. Thus it comes as no surprise that the first legal regulation that God ever implements, the first piece of Torah, as it were, regards the protection of life. That's Genesis 9, 4 through 6, the idea, do not kill and do not shed blood. That is the beginning of Torah, at least my reading of these texts. So looking at Genesis as a foundational text aimed at providing the bottom layer, as it were, of a religious symbol system, it is of utmost importance to realize that God's care for life, the value of all life, human and animal, and the protection of life are the first elements in the symbol system. And if someone asked me what my Christianity was, what it is about, then this would definitely be a significant part of my answer. So trying to find common language. Is it that the value of life? Is that a piece that, in a way, these texts suggested could be something like common language? Maybe one little spark. Second point, or second example, the encounter with God. Let's focus for a moment on the encounter between God and the people that God chooses as another important topic in the book of Genesis. As James Kugel observed in a book called The God of Old, the encounter between Adonai and Israel has a somewhat erratic edge in most of the pertinent stories. Different from Exodus, where Adonai imposes himself on Israel with utmost determination and power, the God of the ancestral narratives, quote, turns up around the street corner dressed like an ordinary person, without always leaving any deeper traces of his presence. Genesis is a book in which Israel's ancestors get to know the one who presents himself as the God who promises to be with them, language that always occurs, I'm with you. However, precisely because this encounter remains in the realm of uncertainty and surprise, it is not based on any prior commitment. Again, a quote from Kugel. Presumably, Abraham is just walking along one day or sitting somewhere when God starts talking to him. But even to put things that way is to distort somewhat the character of this passage. What Abraham was doing or had done before was just not important from the text's standpoint. God spoke to Abraham, and that was all that mattered. End of quote. Correspondingly, the values that are highlighted in this relationship are different from the ones in the Exodus and Sinai narratives. It is not so much obedience before the law, but trust in God's promises that characterizes the encounter between early Israel and their God. This can also be seen in language typical of Genesis. The protagonists of these stories walk with or walk before God. Genesis 5, 6, 17, 24, 48, and so on. The vocabulary here is important because what it highlights are not so much certain ethical norms, but rather the specific values and virtues around which the lives of the matriarchs and patriarchs materialize. Why they do, what they do, where they go, how they interact with each other and with foreigners is presented as a consequence of this walking with and before God. While not entirely accurate, one could call this type a form of virtue ethics, although the virtues are not so much interpersonal forms of behavior, but flow from a particular religious experience, namely the encounter with God. One might even say that Genesis is, at least to some extent, quite critical of any reliance on the character formation of human beings, since there's hardly a single person in Genesis whose personality does not appear to be somewhat peculiar, if not downright problematic. And they remain that way, they don't improve. It's sort of a constant level most of the time. With the sole exception of Noah, the protagonists are never depicted as moral heroes, but as very real people whose typical behaviors are sometimes all too human. Put in a different way, what brings out the best in the protagonists of the Genesis stories, is not the interaction with other human beings, but the way in which they respond to the divine promises that they receive along the way. So let's look a little more closely at this promise and faith relationship. It goes without saying that promise is one of the central notions in Genesis. The first time that it surfaces is in the flood narrative, when God tells Noah to build an ark because he and his family are the ones that will survive. And as the text says, Noah does exactly what God tells him to do. A few chapters later, Abraham will be the one to receive a promise, and he too will be asked to do something rather counterintuitive, namely leave home and journey to foreign country. There are many peculiarities, don't get that out in the late afternoon, about these promises. First of all, they are given by God whom neither Noah nor Abraham have previously known. Most of us would probably only accept a promise if we knew the person giving it, and we knew that this person deserved trust. However, the narrative makes no effort to present God as someone particularly trustworthy. As a matter of fact, there's preciously little that Genesis says about who that God is. In most of the narratives, he comes out of nowhere, starts to talk without previous announcement, and disappears again. This God does not have a temple, and there are no particular festivals dedicated to him. In other words, there is no specific cult around this deity, which is something unheard of in the world of ancient Near Eastern religion. Some of the same things could be said about the recipients of God's promises, the ancestral families. Abraham and Sarah are presented as random people. They have no particular pedigree, like the heroes of the ancient world, that would predisposition them to receive divine attention. Here too, the narrative makes no effort to idealize the patriarchs and matriarchs. Here too, quite on the contrary, the story mercilessly points to the character flaws of their protagonists. There's selfish and coward behavior, there's envy and greed, suspicion and rage. In other words, these are people just like you and me. So there's nothing that suggests that this God and these people are made for each other and for any lasting relationship. But what then is it that accomplishes just that a profound relationship forms? In my view, it is the encounter between God and the patriarchs, the situation of a promise made and received as an intimate moment in which the only thing that matters is the experience of divine approach and human response. There's a bond that seems to wrap itself around this situation, making them signature moments of religious experience. Genesis is most explicit when it comes to these encounters, where one also finds words and language that one could label religious. Now, maybe the most prominent example, at least in Protestantism and to some extent also in Judaism, is of course Genesis 15, 1 through 6. I'm just going to read that text that of course you all know. Sometime later, the word of the Lord, so I'm using the NRSV, came to Abraham in a vision. He said, "Fear not, Abraham, I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great." And Abraham said, "O Lord God, what can you give me, seeing that I shall die childless, and the one charge of my household is domestic Eliezer?" And Abraham said, "Since you have granted me no offspring, my steward will be my heir." And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, "That shall not be your heir, none but your own very own issue shall be your heir." And he, God, took him outside and said, "Look toward the heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them." And he said, "So shall your offspring be." And he, Abraham, put his trust in the Lord, and he, question is, who is he here, reckoned to him as righteousness. There are many subtle details about this text that highlight the significance of encounter for the religion of Genesis. Initially, Abraham receives a word from God, a traditional salvation oracle beginning with the formulaic phrase, "Fear not," which is how gods throughout the ancient Near Eastern world speak. But this does not inspire trust in Abraham. A standardized salvation oracle will not do. As a matter of fact, he confronts God with the fact that there is no reason for him to believe what God promises. Up to this point in the narrative, God has promised a lot and kept preciously little. Abraham and Sarah will die without children in a foreign land. But then something else happens. God approaches Abraham again, but this time he takes him outside, as if it was taking Abraham by the hand or putting his arm around his shoulder to usher him outside and show him the starry sky. This is a very unique scene because when one looks at the Genesis narratives, it is never entirely clear from where God actually speaks. There's a voice, but there's no physical presence, very different from Exodus. Only in very few moments does God walk into the lives of the human protagonists. For example, the 3 men at Mamre, and of course the famous fight between Jacob and the angel at the Jabbok River. Without making a lot of words, the narrative depicts an intimate moment between God and Abraham, at the end of which Abraham trusts God and God considers Abraham as righteous. So, the language of Emunah and Tzedakah. This is remarkable because nothing has happened so far. God has not kept his promise, and Abraham's trust has not materialized in any tangible manner. And yet, it is clear that a profound relationship has been formed. And this precisely seems to be the point that the text is trying to make. It is this kind of relation-forming encounter that defines what we might call the religious experience. The language here could not be any more plain and basic. There are no conditions, obligations, or provisions. No terms are being laid out that have to be met in order for this relationship to be sustained. To be sure, all of this will follow. There will be a covenant starting with Abraham, and there will be a temple and all the bits and pieces of an institutionalized religion. But it seems that Genesis 15 aims at depicting different layers and different degrees of relevance. First comes this intimate encounter with God, for which there are no words, just metaphors and images, God taking Abraham by his hand and showing him the starry sky. Then there are, in fact, words or religious concepts, the language of faith and justice. And finally, there are institutional forms, like the covenant. So again, if I have to explain how my religion, in this case, my religion functions, this tiered system would certainly be an important part of the answer. And the question is, again, is that something that would be meaningful to others as well, to have this sort of a system that starts with an encounter, that then moves on to terms and language, and then finds a more institutionalized form of religion. Final point, God, the open question. Now, coming from both Genesis 1 and Genesis 15, with the notion that the value of life and the faith-inspiring encounter with God are crucial elements in the religion of Genesis, there's one story in particular that seems to overthrow and in fact abrogate all of this. I mean, of course, Genesis 22, 1 through 9, the binding of Isaac, so the famous Akedah, this abysmally erratic story. Here, the God who requires and requests trust in his promises demands something that violates not only what the promise is about, but also the laws that God established for the protection of life in the world. It is at this point that the theological and ethical trajectories of Genesis collide. There's the absolute value of life that must not be compromised under any circumstances, primeval history. But there's also the value of trust in God, even if the logic of what God commands lies beyond the scope of human understanding. Obviously, this is an extreme case of what behavioral ethics would call a dilemma situation, with the aggravating circumstance that the dilemma does not just occur, but that it is God who deliberately causes it. Now one can make the Akedah a story about Abraham, who has to choose between obedience to God and his conscience as a father. The question then becomes if obedience to God is the ultimate value no matter what. God can give and God can take away as he sees fit. Commentators of all times have made the connection to Job, who, at least in the prologue of the book, is ready to submit to God's sovereign will, with the important difference, however, that Job does not have to make Abraham's choice. Or one can make this a story about God, about a God who remains ultimately unfathomable. Of course, in this particular story, God does not really want Isaac to be sacrificed. The tension dissolves when the angel steps in and a goat is sacrificed. And yet, for a moment in the unfolding narrative, God steps out of all his assigned roles. For a moment, it is not clear if everything up to this point has not been wishful thinking and a pious bubble that's about to erupt. This is a way of saying that God is not limited to how we need God to be. We do not ultimately know God, and we certainly cannot explain God. We see what God allows us to see, and that gives reason to have faith and trust. However, neither faith nor reason encapsulates God. God can require the sacrifice of the firstborn son, which is something that Jews and Christians hold in common, simply because he can. It may be our fragile and vulnerable human disposition that makes us assume that God is all-loving and all about our salvation. But a story like the Akedah, or the Book of Job, or the Passion narratives in the New Testament are indispensable because they keep our faith from trying to own God. Which is why these stories, in particular, belong to the fundamentals of biblical religion. So there's something intriguing about the fact that Genesis has these three principles: the value of life, promise and faith, and then a way of questioning all of that. Obviously, what I've outlined here is not and could not be a full account of the reverse engineering that one can find in Genesis. But I'm fairly convinced that Genesis is an example of the Bible reducing the complexity of its ideas and theologies to certain key elements. So given that we are together here in a colloquy that entertains the idea of having one language, my question would be if Jews and Christians, and I know there's more around the table than just these two, could agree that there are in fact such key elements: the value of life, the faith-inducing encounter with God, and the unfathomable sovereignty of God, and perhaps some other elements that they share in common. Thank you.
Why did you understand the idea of reverse engineering?
I learned in Singapore, and students told me, yes, we know that. My German students have no idea what reverse engineering is, and I traveled to Asia, walked into that class, and said, are you familiar with the concept of reverse engineering? Like, yes, we learned that as undergraduates, something like that. Do we?
Yes, we do have time. So, this is your chance to ask from
I was interested about the nice way that you began was with the statement about one language, or finding a language that would enable successful interfaith dialogue. And towards the end, I wanted to know where you were going with that in terms of how that would work in a Judeo-Christian kind of setting. So it's good that the parameters are there. Father Clooney, Francis Clooney up at Harvard, had given a very nice metaphor, because Georgetown is trying to be as interfaithy as you can get, right? And he says, well, I'm a Jesuit, so I can speak for the Jesuits at Georgetown too. I like that one as a way of starting off interfaith dialogue. But he says, are we going to be those Jesuits that invite all of these different people into our home, give them a place, let them play, let them do what they want, and say that we have all of these people here? Or are we going to invite them into our home, sit and discuss with each and every one of them, figure out why they do what they do, try to learn the language they speak, and then move on from there? So my question from him was, okay, you now know the language that they speak, but what do you want to do with that? Do you just want to open more Center for Social Justices? Do you Centers for Social Justice? Do you want to open another youth corps, interfaith youth? What do you want to do with it? And he said, well, I hope that the enrichment that this would bring would be akin to when I find that my younger Jesuit brother has found devotion to God, and I can see how that makes him feel. I would hope that my interfaith brother or sister can see how I relate to God and find joy in that relationship. And I would also like to see how, for example, a Muslim brother of mine would relate to God in that devotional moment and see them and find joy in that. So my question, I think, is, having found this common language, and obviously we're referring to a Judeo-Christian setting, but if we can pull it out a little bit more, again, I'm kind of utilitarian when it comes to this. Is there an application that we can bring to the campus, whether in the academic side or in the ministry side, that would lend us a little bit more parlance with the administrations?
Ooh. I don't know if this will do anything for administrators. I mean, maybe not. But I mean, as I said at the outset, the concern is more basic. How do, for example, now Christians understand their Christianity? I mean, my students, they will throw all kinds of stuff at you, Trinity and resurrection and all the good stuff, kind of, and they might have no clue what these things mean, or they might simply learn phrases and then reproduce them, something like that, but they can't really tell you, kind of what it is about. They can't elementarize it, they can't reduce complexity, all of that. And that's a real problem. And, kind of, I mean, this is just one example. I mean, Genesis is not all of Christianity or Judaism, kind of, but what if one could start that way, and see that, for example, within the Bible, and I think that's really fascinating, both things occur, I mean, the Bible builds up complexity, I mean, there are incredibly difficult systems of thought, but at the same time, it provides something very basic. And just to observe that these two things are going on, and then maybe in certain conversations emphasize a little more the one side of it, and not the other, not trying to explain what the sacrificial system in Leviticus is, or what Paul means by sacrificial or atonement or something like that. I mean, that's too difficult simply, kind of, but really bring it down to some of the basics that are basic but not simple. So that's, in a sense, the concern.
Thank you.
I would like to suggest another aspect, the value of the search itself. Meaning, when you handle text, you can do two things. One, you find answers to a problem. We have a problem, like Andreas presented it, the complexity of life and religion, the interaction of thereof. And then you find, you go back to when we were young and simple, and things were much, much better, and one person, not too many, interactions were simple, and try to work from there. But I think there is, if you are talking about application, I think the application is in the study itself. Meaning, you tell a student you have a challenge. Take any text, any ancient text, could be the Veda, could be the Bible, and try to find yourself in the text. Try to find your roots in the text, not yourself now. But I believe that people also have very simple roots. We are very complex. But if we look back, if we introspect, we can find very simple roots to our behavior, to our feelings. Now, once you take the text. You will try to interpret it in the way that you discover yourself. So, if we take, let's say, make a workshop, people be doing that, then everyone has his own interpretation of the text because everyone found himself in the text. And now let's put it all together and see what we come up with. Let's say a new such as this, a new interpretation of the Bible. It does not come for all these boring sources, of people that try to impose their thought or their philosophy on the text, but people that try to find themselves here. Here I am, Abraham, I am standing in front of God and have to plead for Sodom. I'm a person that gets a revelation. What am I doing? To collect this, and I think this could be a wonderful language of understanding each other. So it's something a little bit akin to therapy, to the dynamics of a therapy, but it's not a healing. It's not such a it is a healing process, but the idea is not so much the healing process as to finding out who you are and the construction of the world and other people in relation to you. And I think this is very applicable, and it could be done. And I think it will make people more relaxed about themselves and other people and other believers, and even in the simple understanding that if the world did not fall down until now, it's not going to happen now. So you can be more relaxed, you can introspect, you can wait and see how it develops.
Any comments, any questions, any remarks? Yeah, again.
I'm sorry about this. It's an interesting kind of discussion. So the reverse engineering bit, I was thinking another kind of application question for reverse engineering. If we were to sit together as interfaith people, and again looking at the the spiritual leadership in academia kind of part of it, approach the question of interfaith from the student's perspective. Is there a way that we can reverse engineer? It's a bad way of saying things, but I hope you're going to get what I'm trying to say. Is there a way that we can find out what our students would find most meaningful from all of our traditions and help one another to present it in such a way that they don't go off kilter?
Well, that would be the hope. I mean, first of all, I have no idea if this reverse engineering idea is really good. I mean, it needs to be tested. I mean, for now, this is an idea, not more. It's good. I mean, Rowley says it's good, so kind of we're good. We're all done. No, but is that something really? Can one assume that there are these two layers? That there's something simple and there's a blueprint, and that something could be reverse engineered. All of that, is that applicable to religion? I mean, religions are not. It's not computer software or anything like that. So, I mean, that would be the first question: is it working? Is it something that's useful? And these are sort of experiments with that, and looking at certain texts. And you look at Genesis because, yes, I mean, it's a text that comes before the Sinai events, before things get really complex and crazy, to put it that way. So these are all little attempts, And if that was true, that there was such a layer, something very basic, then of course the question would be, would this also be the stuff that students can get, that maybe lay people can get? I mean, this is a paper that, in a simplified form, without all the academic stuff, I hope is something that normal people could understand. About the value of life, about encounter, and all these things, and about this God who remains ultimately controllable. So, I mean, I do think that would be my hope. If this whole thing is worth anything, we'll be able to accomplish it.
Please.
So I remark, pick up on what you just said, is the concept of reverse engineering as a project, the way I see it, and you might not agree with me, but that's what I'm getting from you, that's where I see it. It's even more relevant for the students in the following sense. In the current age, there's an unprecedented connection between the technology and the science, in which we live more technology than science, but and structures that used to have their own native symbolic order. We used to have spiritual definitions of the self or in the various traditions. And today, a lot of that is getting re-encoded into terms of technology, often information technology, but the technological sense of what's your OS, how are you processing this information, and even identity as information. Now, in that atmosphere, conceptions of reverse engineering are not only useful, I see them as inevitable. So if we don't tap into that, we're missing on the way things work. That's what I meant.
Yeah, but I mean, what I said initially, that it's not even religious people who get it. I mean, that's what I see with my very pious students. I mean, I have sort of the two extremes: the one that have no religious backgrounds, and the other others that have a little too much religious background. Kind of, and know exactly what it's about. They come to grad school, kind of, and they tell you what their religion is about, and there's no way of getting at that, because they think there's a hostile world out there which they call secular, so you have to hold on even more powerful way, kind of your tradition, so you get that divide, and that's just a very unhealthy development from what I can tell, because even in Germany you have this sort of fundamentalism and secularism sort of side by side, and kind of it's sometimes in the same classroom. I don't know if you all have this experience, but that's something that's going on for everyone.
One more thing. Many times when you approach text, you know what it's going to say. You assume, you read the first line, and you think you know what it's going to say. And then you cannot read it anymore, because you read what you thought. You already have your... So some people that I know simply give up after the first line. Why should they read? Because they know what's going to say, and the reading will not change their opinion. And, and then if it's not exactly what they thought it will say, it will cut the corners and push the text into their preconception. When Andreas speaks about two people that are too pious, too religious, or too acquainted with the text, they know what the text is supposed to say. So the text is part of our identity, of our inheritance, so we are familiar with it, and that's terrible. We cannot study it anymore. It's lost. The text is lost for us, because we know the message. No matter how many times we'll try to study it, our brains are closed. It is someone put concrete in our ears, and our brains are immobile. But if you take the text, and especially it's very effective, the text is really new. So you take the Vedic. It takes, for us, for people that the Genesis is the original text, you can take something that you don't know, or you pretend that you don't know. And you start reading, and you talk about students, I think the most interesting thing will be students that never saw the text before. I tried with small children, my grandchildren, that had no... I try to be the first to introduce the text to them. And it's really amazing. They discover the text as if it was given to them, and it's very meaningful to them. And it's not my text. If it's mine, they close their mind to it. Why should they bother with your text? Why should I bother with Hindu text? It's not mine. But if I take it, it's fresh. It's new. It could be mine. So I go into the woods. We discuss this. This parable of comparing the text to a wood, that you can make many paths, but you have to believe that it's worth crossing the woods, and you should not cut the trees. These are the two rules. And then it's yours. You find your own way. You do your own thing. And I think it's really an amazing experience, especially if you are a layman, especially if you are not familiar with the text before.
I'm wondering if there aren't some risks involved in bringing, say, students or anyone to a text to look at it for the first time or to see it with new eyes, because that could go in all sorts of directions that I might not be comfortable with. So I think there's risk, but there's also opportunity. I was working with a student one time who was having some issues around forgiveness and feeling forgiven. And so I said, well, you know the story of the prodigal son. And she was a very religious person, but she didn't know the story. And I told her the story, and her response was, "That's interesting. I don't like that very much." There was something in it, and it never occurred to me that someone would say, "There's something troubling about that story of complete forgiveness." So it can go in.
But don't you think it is very interesting that complete forgiveness bothers people? We accept it too much. It's too self-understood that self-forgiveness, God's self-forgiveness is unlimited, but maybe it's not true. That it bothers, and we should consider this point.
I mean, isolated text is always a problem. I mean, which is why I'm sort of looking at multiple texts that forms a little bit of a system. I mean, there's Genesis 22, which is a fascinating text precisely because it challenges some of the nice stuff in Genesis 15. With good God, trust and righteousness and all of that. That could be a little too sweet, And some people would simply say, kind of. I mean, this is wishful. But then the text in itself, kind of just challenges that and says, maybe not. Maybe there is a deity who simply wants the firstborn child to be sacrificed. So suddenly you are not just in the message of a text, but in a theological discourse that happens between these texts. Right. And then it gets a little more interesting, also more challenging, you might lose some people, and dangerous potentially. But I mean, to some extent, as an exegetus Bible scholar, I would say if the texts can't do that, then maybe I'm in the wrong field or something like that.
I'll give you an example in this room. I can give it when we worked on a project. So one of the things that we saw is Abraham pleading for Sodom people, for the people of Sodom. And it was very strange because if people in Sodom suffer and we have rape and murder and violence, so Abraham says, don't kill them because they're 7 righteous people. What about all the suffering people? They're going suffering because God has mercy. It's not mercy. To allow suffering is not mercy. And this was not a divine idea. It was Abraham's idea. Suspend their sentence because there are few righteous people. Very. Okay, so you struggle with that. You try to understand what's happening here. And it's human. It's not divine. It relates to you. You are standing there and say. And then we looked at the Quran. The first time I saw this surah in the Quran, the same story. Anyone saw the surah in the Quran, the 173 surah in the Quran? And in the Quran it says the same story, that the angels come to Abraham and they tell him you will have a child. It starts the same way. And then it goes. So Abraham asks them, where are you going? Whence are you going? So they say there is a town of sinners, we are going to destroy it. So Abraham answers, go and may God be with you. Now, if you see yourself in the text, who is, you see yourself as this Abraham of the Old Testament, Abraham of the Quran. What is there any difference between these people? And I think, did it affect any heritage? Does it explain anything? And so you're right. It's not safe. It's not always politically correct. But I think it's very interesting. And the problem of secularism in academia is not the danger. It's that it's not being relevant. Once it's dangerous, it becomes relevant. And I think we should try to create relevance and not create safety.
John.
Yeah, I think when we think about taking the text across to a new culture, what we're seeing practiced today by folks is a Discovery Bible study where you just take the story, you don't bring your interpretation, but you share the story, you ask what it means, and then the people in that culture give their interpretation to it, and you say, okay, if that's true, then how do you live that out this week? And you invite them to go practice it. And so what that does is it prevents us from taking our cultural filter and colonializing it, taking it to another group of people, but allowing them to see something in the text that I had filtered out. For example, how do we interpret the story of Joseph? What's the main theme? And if you were to ask in American settings, we might say it's something about, that he was a man of virtue, he stuck to his principles, all of that. But if you ask someone in northern Nigeria, what's the overarching theme of Joseph, they would say something like, it doesn't matter how far away you get from your family, you never forget them.
Yeah.
Well, that's something I don't see, but it's something that people in another culture see.
And they can show it to you and can...
And so I think, in a Christian perspective, we have a Trinitarian view, and so we trust that the Spirit of God is at work in helping people understand and provide interpretation that will maybe different than my interpretation, but it will have truth and validity.
Well, maybe to add one little, I agree with everything that you just said. On the other hand, the job of Bible scholars, there will be sort of a reducing of complexity going on. Whenever people read the Bible, they want a message, which is you reduce a complex thing to something simple. That's what we all do. Now, and that can be very inspiring and all of that, but I think it's our job as professors, as teachers, kind of maybe not just allow anything, but kind of to show, kind of these are maybe more likely readings because they respond to the text, to its language, and all of that. Maybe a little more than some others. So that's at least something that I see as my job. For example, in Genesis 15, the interesting thing is that most German Bible translations will not say, kind of God took Abraham and kind of ushered him outside. They have something like God told Abraham to go outside. So God is still in heaven. And tells Abraham, go out. So they take out this intimate moment thing with God and Abraham. And, that's the kind of stuff you have to know as a Bible scholar and say, kind of, it's in there. It's the
translator's work.
Yeah, Luther was not about intimate moments with God simply, kind of, he wants a sovereign God in heaven, kind of, and so these things, you do want to observe. I think that's still important. And so you have the job as a moderator, if you want to. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
All good? Yeah. Or not quite.
So, we go basically